Chapter 29. The person, the goddess, representing all that was taken from Tommy, the roots of the trauma that prickled at his skin and racked his head, stood in front of him. Kristen Kraft, Phil's deceased wife and Wilbur's mother. Kristen stared at him, a world of emotions and thoughts idly swirling in her black and tainted eyes. Eyes that had seen all forms of death. Betrayals reminiscent of easier days. Suicides too similar to Sisyphus's boulder. And children begging for more time. His tongue wouldn't let him speak. But he didn't know what he'd say, even if he could. Tommy had visited her gravestone, read her name and departed date on the monument. She wasn't supposed to be one of them. One of the gods who tormented his inapparent free will and let dream release levels of hell upon him. She was supposed to be dead. A wife and mother removed too soon from a loving and complete family. Not death itself. I've wanted to meet you for a while now, Kristen said, breaking the tense silence. She smiled sweetly, yet there was a layer hidden in the upturned corners of her lips. Something dark. Tommy hated it. The casual demeanor of someone so dangerous. This was a person more powerful than Dream. The one who reduced the god to a quivering mess in the palace and encased him in shadows with a wordless command. If Dream could project and extort so much pain and anguish onto Tommy whilst being a minor god, then what could Kristen do? What would she do to him? His hands shook. But whether it was out of fear or anger was the question. Everyone had mourned her. Wilbur had been destroyed by her death, and it turned out she wasn't even fucking dead. She had wrecked a once whole family, decimated their relationships with each other, fractured the love and communication between a grieving father and a son left dealing with everything. And for what? She was death. Surely she understood the ruination that it caused, the evil of its nature. And yet she let it leave a mark on his family. Are you the reason I died earlier than I should have? He asked, trying to keep his fury under control. Though, by the way her grip tightened on her scythe, it was poorly hidden. She nodded solemnly, almost embarrassed by her answer. He bit his inner cheek. He shouldn't lose himself to his anger, especially to her. Even though she was responsible for it, this was Phil's wife. The woman in those framed photographs on the wall, who smiled so widely with her arms around her husband and son. The woman Phil loved with all his heart. But he couldn't keep it to himself. He shouldn't have died in Wilbur's arms, on the floor of a kitchen, with Phil knelt by his side, and Techno pleading for the myth to be solved, for Ariadne to be saved by her Dionysus. The thread around his neck strained. I didn't even get to say goodbye, he spat. His jaw clenched, and teeth gritted. You should know how important goodbyes are with how you fucked Wilbur up with yours. His conversation with Wilbur, in the graveyard, was one he could never forget. How Wilbur's self-destruction and hatred stemmed from her delirious words in that hospital bed. She lowered her head, the bonnet covering her shame. Were you even sick, or was that a lie? He asked. His eyes narrowed at the deity. Death does not lie, Kristen stated. Tommy scoffed. But it takes. It takes so fucking much, and you just let it. If there is anyone else in these realms who understands the burden of death, Tommy, it is me, she whispered, her tone heavy and somber. Her lips thinned as she continued. I tried to stay. I tried to be a mother to Wilbur for years, until I needed to return to my duties. And even then I tried to balance being mortal and the taker of souls, and that killed me. He flinched inwards as she stepped forward. Her movement echoed in the void, making the darkness seem more daunting and emptier than before. That sickness was real. It stole every part of me and almost my godhood. It took me centuries in the underworld to build that back up, but it was worth it. Seeing my boy say my name for the first time. Being there as he learned how to play the piano and sing his heart out to any tune he came across. It was all worth it. "You still left them," he muttered, glaring at her. "Did they even know?" Kristen lowered her scythe deeper into her side. No. No, Phil and Wilbur didn't know of my godhood. She admitted. Pain plastered beneath the shadow of the bonnet. Techno, though, he knew. A timid smile snuck upon her lips. And he even said it was easy to figure out, ever since he found out about the reality of our mythology from Nikki. "And you didn't think to tell them that you weren't truly gone?" He thought of a younger Wilbur, one more tormented and explosive, riddling with self-loathing and disgust, and what difference it would have done if he knew. If he knew that the mother he was mourning could still see him grow and progress, as he learned the harder chords of the guitar, and how to control his breathing when singing. A mother, still absent, but not gone. Trust me when I say, it hurts less when they think death is permanent, she said. Her brows furrowed at him, as if she knew what thoughts circled his head. There is pain in waiting for the slightest possibility that they'd return, that I'd return. He shook his head. Do you really believe that? Kristen stayed silent. Phil wouldn't have thought his unconditional love for a woman who brought light to the darkest rooms and smiles to uneased souls would forever be one-sided the moment that gravestone heeded its position in that dirt. If he knew. I did what I had to do, Tommy. She said at last, her voice more wistful than before. Was taking me away from them something you needed to do as well? You were taken too soon for a reason, Tommy. He bristled in his anger. His fists curled, nails piercing his palms. He couldn't stop the thoughts of how he would one day forget Wilbur's face and smile, yet forever remember the grip of his arms as his older brother held him as he died. Zagreus had gone too far, she said. His petty revenge for his patron's death exceeded centuries of pain for you, and you were just a child. She watched carefully as his shoulders tensed. He never did specify why you're like this, did he? Dream had told him numerous reasons, ones that only provoked more questions that would remain unanswered and mocked. That it was a lesson, a punishment, something he deserved. But it didn't make sense. As I said, it was petty, Kristen began. You and your little revolution killed King George, Zagreus' patron. So, he believed this curse would suffice. A good and limited punishment. Reincarnation and rebirth always was his specialty. Her tone turned bitter. But he didn't expect it to progress this far, to the point where one boy lived more lives and deaths than he should have. An amulet appeared in Kristen's hands, engraved with the same symbol that branded his left wrist. Dream's amulet. Yet no scratches dulled its shine. She placed it in Tommy's palm, the cold metal inducing shivers across his tense shoulders. There was writing in the gold, names with Greek myths attached to them. Tobias _ Pandora, Fundi Donatahan, Medea. He frowned at the names, at their myths, and froze as he read his brother's. Prometheus. His brother was Prometheus, the trickster titan who defied Zeus and stole his fire, bringing knowledge and survival to humanity, ensuring civilizations and safety. His actions brought great consequences for both himself and the humanity he intended to save. Prometheus was condemned to a cycle of pain, nailed to a mountain to have his liver eaten and replenished. And Zeus created Pandora and her box filled with all the darkness, sins, disease, poverty, war, and death as a punishment to mankind. Just like with his brother, Prometheus reduced the world to a cruel fate after his departure, sowing the seeds of inevitable destruction. Tommy grasped the amulet harshly in his hands, the object that held all the curses of his loved ones, the power that devastated everything. I thought, for a while, that the king was the only mortal Zagreus had grown attached to, but then you came under my radar. Kristen announced, and the amulet vanished from his grip. He stilled, not liking this information. "What are you going to do with him?" he asked, hating how a part of him was concerned for Dream. Kristen's mouth twisted with distaste. "Why do you care what happens to him?" "I don't, he..." Tommy trailed off, not sure. His head ached with conflict. Dream's last moment in the void was him trying to protect Tommy, standing in front of him, almost shielding him from more harm. "Are you going to kill him?" "Even I, as Death, cannot kill a god," she retorted. "You sound as if you've tried." "Oh, don't tell me you haven't noticed Dream's tired appearance. The blood on his mask, the scratches on his amulet, his draining power. That was all I could do." "But why?" Tommy asked. "Why do you care?" Kristen sighed and moved forward. He should be scared. This was death. No, this was capital D death, the root of Tommy's demise and problems. But the soft gleam in her face, the roundness in her eyes and sharp cheekbones as she smiled, it didn't bring fear. It brought solace. Something so appeasing that the war in his head faded as he focused on her presence. Her hand reached over in front of him, steady, yet hesitant. Despite the forceful nature of death, how it took with no regard of acceptance, she waited for his permission. He nodded, and she gently caressed his cheek, held his face in her hand. It was different to the other god's touch, to Dream's, who clasped his cheek with such guilt, aware that the pain on Tommy's face was his fault. Kristen, though, she touched him as if, instead of death, a mother goddess, one so benevolent and mindful to all her creation. "I must admit, at first I only paid attention to you because of Phil," she said. Light sparked in her eyes as she spoke his name. "It's the reason I found out that there was still lost souls cursed by Zagreus. But as I watched you, you intrigued me." Her face creased with consideration. "And there was something weirdly endearing about you. Lovable, even." His cheeks blushed. Anger still festered beneath his skin. Yet, just by hearing her voice, as she spoke of her family and apparent love for him, it all halted. Death was a scary thing, but no one ever discussed the enticing nature of it. The part that hoped to succumb under its careful grip one day. Hopefully on a pleasant and fulfilling evening where all had been finished and there was nothing left to do but wait. Kristen's index finger brushed along his flustered face, chuckling as it reddened. It was the same hearty chuckle that Phil always did. She pinched his cheek before letting go. "Well, I'm not surprised the embodiment of death loves me," Tommy said in a joking manner, though there was a sinister truth to it. Her black wings ruffled, hovering closer to her shoulder in almost a protective fashion. "I am sorry that my domain hasn't let you rest," she said softly, regret deep in her tone. "But it is because of Zagreus that this has happened. His curse has brought my domain along." Tommy stalled at the reminder. Her previous touch on his cheek distracted him from the impending storm inside his head. "Dream cared about me once." Kristen frowned. "Are you sure?" Disregarding his doubt, he bit his lip and nodded. "We were friends at one point." "Okay," she said, still skeptical. "Prove it to me, then. Prove to me that Zagreus isn't all that bad, and I'll spare him." She made it sound like a game, a fun little activity that induced nothing but conflict in Tommy. He didn't know what to do. He didn't necessarily want Dream to get off scot-free. The fucker deserved something to happen to him, but not death. Well, maybe, but... Tommy sighed. He just didn't know. "They say death is the cousin of sleep," Kristen said, with her hand returning to his cheek. The cold trailed up to under his eyes. "Close your eyes and think of him. We shall see if there is redemption in him." Tommy huffed before shutting his eyes. He was unsure of what to think about. His relationship with Dream was a difficult one. For centuries, Tommy had been a gaming piece for Dream to knock about, to play with, so the years of boredom passed by easily. Whether that meant watching a child try to figure out the myth of his lifetime before he even developed and discovered his true self and matured personality, or torturing him in a state of darkness. But there was a time, a simpler time, when Tommy considered Dream his friend, someone he trusted wholeheartedly, someone he could rely on and ranted to when the harsh winds and loneliness in exile got too much. But, as with everything good in Tommy's life, that trust and happiness subverted itself and twisted into just another face of an abuser, hidden with tight smiles and hidden motives. His hand rubbed the tattoo on his left wrist, and the biting breeze of exile returned. Kristen was no longer by his side, and the fear that had been prickling under his skin ever since he opened his eyes to the void resurfaced. He needed her comforting touch and contradicting presence, an aura that drained the warmth out of all life, yet provided a substitute far better than heat. He was back on that island, the lands of Logstadshire, his own personal purgatory, though no sins were cleansed here. The tent Dream had helped him set up during his first week was still mounted in the mud. The jukebox Dream gifted him was there as well, visible as the slit of the tent peered open with each gust of wind. Such scenery, such items that once brought Tommy serenity, comfortability, and routine, now brought pain. Tommy noticed a figure in the distance, a cloaked man sitting on the docks. It was Dream, an unmasked mortal who hid his godhood from a vulnerable boy, too busy grieving the death of his older brother and betrayal from his best friend to notice the ill intentions of the man. He remembered when he used to sit by Dream at the docks and stared down at the ocean floor, dreading the thoughts looming in his head. The desire to jump in with an anvil tied to his ankle, the yearning for his lungs to collapse as water seeped in, the want for a slow and painful death. But Dream was there for him. He rubbed his back, distracted him, and played a disc in the jukebox. It didn't take long for that welcoming rub on his back to turn into punches, wrenching kicks to the gut, and cuts from knives that once used to make meals for each other on cold, lonely nights. The wind picked up, violating the sensitivity of Tommy's skin, and Dream had moved. The deceitful god now stood next to the stone path, towering over a younger Tommy. Rips tore into his clothing. The blue in his eyes had faded, and one of his shoes was missing. Exhaustion took its toll on him. He looked dead, and if Tommy recalled correctly, he wanted to be. The same man who offered Tommy all the comfort and materials he needed at the beginning of exile had a flint and steel in one hand and an explosive in the other. Put your items in the hole. The breeze swallowed Dream's cruel order, words that became an obsessive tradition. But the Tommies of both lives heard them perfectly. He couldn't stop his heart from pounding. He couldn't do anything. It was happening again, and there was nothing he could do about it. This was Dream. The predecessor of every scar on his body, every wound that taunted his sleepless nights. Change was a common subject to Tommy. With how every 16 years, everything he ever knew vanished. But this change, the change from Dream to the Zagreus he knew now, that was a change he didn't know how to deal with. The one who, moments prior in the void, had attempted to protect him, was the one responsible for everything painful in Tommy's life. A whimper left his lips as the explosion rattled the leaves off the oak trees and blistered younger Tommy's skin. No one ever told him the correct distance to stand from an explosive. Croaks from ravens pierced his ears, even more than the volatile blasts of younger Tommy's items combusting under a tyrant god's hand. He blinked, a single tear skimming down his cheek, and the lingering terrain of Logstadshire shifted to the black of the void. Wings swept against his shoulders, and arms dressed in silk wrapped around him. A hug from death felt more familiar than any other touch he had received. He didn't realize he was shaking. "I'm sorry," Kristen mumbled into his trembling skin, her face wet. "I didn't mean to make you see that. It's my fault for thinking I was over it all," he whispered, exhausted. Tommy nestled deeper into her arms, finding comfort in the soft feathers of her wings. He needed to forget that place, the explosives, the tower he almost jumped off. He wanted it all to go away, but it never would. She shook her head adamantly. "There are things I am not over, Tommy. No matter how many eons have passed for me since I first remember meeting Phil, I will never get over the guilt I have for leaving him alone." Her voice wavered. "The love I felt, the love I still feel for him, haunts me." Kristen kissed the top of his head. "Despite me being many, many years old, healing is new to me," she said. "There is hope for you. Not everything is linear, Tommy." He frowned. "How old are... I thought Phil taught you better than to ask a woman how old she is." Kristen joked, and Tommy forgot about the shaking in his hands for just a moment. Part of him wanted to stay here, in the void with Kristen, even despite the rebirth he could feel pulling at his soul, and anger still buried in his gut towards the very woman who hugged him. She had taken him from his family too soon. He could never forgive that. "You know," I'm friends with Adrastia, Kristen said, and paused for the information to sink in. Adrastia, the goddess of inevitable fate, the pressing necessity of punishment. And she's closely linked to Nemesis, the goddess of divine retribution and revenge. He scowled, not understanding what she meant. You can decide what happens to Zagreus, Tommy. A breath lodged in Tommy's throat. I think your fate for him would be kinder than mine, she continued. The idea that aggravated his head was far from kind. From just the reminder of exile, it was something cruel, malicious, yet deserving. Needed. Karma sounded nice. I have one idea, he said. He spoke it aloud, and Kristen grinned. A fitting punishment, she stated, nodding. I'm sure he'll enjoy that. Silence bloomed between them. Tommy's eyes focused on the sharp blade of Kristen's scythe. What do I do now? His voice faltered, frightened of her upcoming answer. Are you going to make me go through rebirth again? His body knew it was soon. The symptoms were there. Boiling blood under his skin, aching to his back, his new mark around his neck, pulsing. It was soon. You have lived so many lives, but have you truly lived at all? Kristen smiled at him sadly, regret in the creases of her mouth. Everyone you've ever loved has died on you, and finally, you died on them. She sighed, with weighted remorse. I took you earlier for a reason, Tommy. I think it's time this cycle breaks. Tommy froze at her words. He didn't dare move. I'm sure Hades won't mind one resurrection. She chuckled, and elation brightened her eyes. Send them my love, would you? With a cold touch to his right wrist, one that blistered his skin and inked his departing soul, Tommy was finally free. A white sheet brushed against his lips as he sharply exhaled, his clumped eyelashes sticking to the fabric. Everything hurt. Every muscle he tensed, every limb he moved, pain cremated him. He winced and pushed the sheet off his body, disregarding how his skin screamed and itched at the movement. The air he breathed didn't pierce his lungs nor poison his tongue. It was familiar, and carried the same smell as that sandalwood incense Techno convinced Phil to put in the living room. It was bright. This wasn't the void. Soft cushions anchored laid underneath him. He was back. He was home. A shorter boy with brown hair collided into him, arms squeezed around his waist. Tubbo's sobbing echoed in his ears, and his shoulder dampened with tears. Tommy couldn't stop the smile from curling onto his lips. His cheeks ached, but he didn't care. It's okay, I'm not going anywhere. Not anymore. Tommy whispered into Tubbo's hair, gripping the back of his t-shirt tightly as the other clung to his chest. He inhaled deeply, grinning to himself. This was real. This was real. Tubbo was really in his arms, and no curse reduced the time he had left with him. He could stay here forever, and there wasn't a piece of him that didn't want to. Reluctantly, Tubbo let go of him, his eyes red and puffy. He expected his best friend to say something back, to express how glad he was that Tommy was back or how he missed him. Tubbo shared a smile with him, then promptly slapped Tommy round the face. You fucking piece of shit, don't do that again! Ow, what the fuck? You promised me you wouldn't die! Tubbo exclaimed as Tommy held his face. You said you wouldn't leave whilst knowing you eventually would? Okay, can we do this another time, or... He slapped Tommy again. Stop hitting me! Tubbo leaned into his side. I love you. You sure have a fucked way to show it, he grumbled, still holding the part of his face that stung. But yeah, I love you too. Tubbo laughed and poked his cheek, ignoring the insults Tommy muttered under his breath. A voice stuttered. Ronbu stood by the entrance to the living room, shock evident in his face as he gaped at them. His eyes flickered down at Tommy's lap and rested back on the two of them. Tommy looked down and frowned at the crumpled alliums. Ronbu's face flushed. You seriously got me flowers? You just came back to life, and your first interaction with me is to insult my birthday gift to you. Ronbu complained, his brows furrowed. He paused, not knowing how to answer. Yeah? Ronbu tackled him into a hug, unconcerned about the squished flowers. Tommy welcomed the boy's grip and chuckled at the awkward position between the three of them on the corner of the sofa. I missed you so much. How long was I gone? Tommy asked as Ronbu refused to ease his grasp, whilst Tubbo tried to fit more comfortably on the sofa. A day. Fucking pussies. He joked, pushing at Ronbu's shoulder. You couldn't even last a day without me. Shut up. The two muttered, and huddled closer to him, almost afraid Tommy would disappear. The tingling on his skin hadn't stopped since his first breath under the white sheet. It hurt to be hugged, to be touched by hands that weren't cold and empty, transparent like the ghosts, but he let it proceed. They needed it more than him. He honestly thought his chest would explode at how fast his heart was beating. Not out of fear, like in the void, but out of joy. He was back. Back in the arms of those he loved, with no threat of upcoming and inevitable death. He could finally finish school, with Tubbo and Ronbu by his side, grow old with the crafts as their adopted son. Tubbo, where did you put the... Nikki stopped in her step. The plastic cup in her hands dropped to the floor. Holy shit. You are correct about the holy part, because I'm kinda like Jesus now, Tommy said with a grin. Instead of the usual begrudging annoyance flashing over Nikki's face, her eyes widened, and she beamed at him. Nikki stepped closer, and with hesitancy, she reached over and touched his arm, flinching at the contact. Yes, I'm alive, he said, still grinning at her. How? She gasped. Death liked me, Tommy explained vaguely, confusing the room even more. What's on your arm? Nikki asked, pointing at his right wrist. He looked down at where his right sleeve had been pulled up. It was another tattoo, black ink engraving the symbol of Thanatos. Phil is gonna fucking kill me. Technically, he already has. Tubbo, shut it. Tommy let out a laugh. It felt rough on his throat, as if laughter was uncommon. Of course, Kristen had left him a departing gift, something she knew Phil would hate. He was alive. He was fucking alive. No longer bound to a curse that took everything from him. His first family, his freedom, sanity, and childhood. He could enjoy life without counting down the days until the end. For the first time in his life, Tommy was 16, and he couldn't be happier.